Hey, we're live.
Hello and welcome to Teacher Time. Clever, because I'm actually going to have some tea while we chat. I'm so glad you're joining us. Not only you out there in video world, but also Liz. It's very good to see you. I hope you're doing okay.
I am. I am not drinking tea today. I'm drinking hot chocolate out of my Arizona mug.
Oh, okay. Very nice. Very nice. This is the very first episode of Teacher Time, so I think it's worth kind of chatting about at first, what is this all about? And it's all about literally chatting. It is about chatting with you, with other BRI staff someday, some guests someday, probably, but most importantly, the teachers out there. General public and everybody else who loves history, that's great. You're more than welcome. But we are in the teacher world. And so that's sort of what this is all about. We'll have a bunch of segments every week. We'll talk about whatever's going on currently or ideas that we think are important. We'll dive into pedagogy. We'll dive into historical content, things in civics. But most importantly, just form a community of folks. So this is an invitation to everyone, whether or not you're watching us live or in between our episodes. If you contact us, we want to have that dialogue with all of you because it's pretty amazing being able to chat these days with people across the country. Probably should give a little background on me since it's the first episode. My name is Gary Colletti. I'm Director of Teacher and Student Programs here at BRI, Bill of Rights Institute. And so any teacher or student programs that are in person or online or webinars or like that, that's something that we have to do with. And we've got a great team of educators who work on that. I should introduce Liz. Why don't you say who you are for everybody?
Hi, everybody. I am Liz Evans. I am the programs manager for the Western region. And I see we have Kimberly from Southern California. Hi, Kimberly. You are in my area. Um,
Hey.
I was in education or have been in education for 18 years. Most recently taught last year and got to taught. I've taught high school, I've taught middle school, a little bit of everything, but I now work for BRI because I love helping teachers and I love social studies. So it's the perfect job.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really what this is all about, right? Just us chatting about social studies. And when I say us, I not only mean you and me, but also all the teachers out there, including Kimberly from Southern California. And to have that kind of back and forth, because as you can tell already, the excitement that we get from just talking about these things, we hope is infectious. Um, that being said, I don't think each episode is ever going to conquer everything in civics. And so we encourage you to keep coming back and to keep that dialogue coming. This being our very first episode, we did have a framing question. I can't help it. It's like the aim in my classroom. It's January 2021. And so the big question of the day that we're going to be kind of revolving around is that how are we planning on teaching and living in 2021? Acknowledging what last year was like, trying to see what this year is like and is going to be like. And so that's the overarching thing. For each episode, we're going to publish the questions out there for you. So eventually, we'd love to get to the point where when you have questions, that might be a future episode of things that we talk about. And so as we think about these things, think about what you'd like to discuss, and we want to genuinely form that community that's out there. I see Barbara's out there and Vince already. We have some folks here who are happy to chat. We're actually being sent some of the questions. And so if we don't see everything, if we don't acknowledge any of your questions, I do apologize. We're sort of seeing some of them, just, full disclosure. But that's basically it. Long story short, we're here every other week to chat as teachers. I didn't mention, of course, I was a teacher. I wasn't quite 18. I was only 14 years, but that was in New York and Virginia, social studies. And it's great. I do miss the classroom, to be perfectly honest with you, but it's not that we're not teaching here. It's just a different kind of education that we do. So anyway, I feel like that's a pretty good overarching, view of what the show is about. I think it's time to start with our first segment. That's taking a look at the news cycle. What's going on out there. So when we say the news, I'm not pulling from any particular source. I think it's important to pull from lots of different places. It's more about like the zeitgeist, just what's going on out there. When we say the news, we mean like writ large. And for those who know, this episode is airing on the 12th of January, 2021. So I'm going to put it out there, Liz. It's hard not to say that the general news was the events of last week. And to phrase it the way that I've seen written in a lot of places, most notably places like All Sides and others, because even the way you phrase what happened, I think already gets into some interesting opportunities for dialogue. But the way I've seen it written was chaos. I've seen riot, I've seen breach, I've seen lots of different words going on to it. So our take, your take, how do we wrap our heads around what's going on in the news right now? And specifically, I mean, what happened at the Capitol and the aftermath.
It is interesting. I think the word I've heard the most is insurrection, even, and again, on social media, on news channels, all of this. And, teachers right now are really looking at, how do I take this and talk about it in my classroom? How do I kind of do that? And for me, my fourth grader is at home. She is learning virtually. And so, the conversations that I have with her, because I want to be honest, I want to be truthful, but as we know, Gary, things come out every single day, and news isn't static. It's not like, well, this happened, we're going to move on to the next thing. It's constantly moving. And I think that being an observer of that has been a really interesting thing, because like you said, words matter, and how they're used in the news really, really matters.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think of it again, imagining the classroom hat on. It's that, how do you place it in a continuum, right? How do you place an event that isn't one day event, I think, right? But how do you lead up to something when it's, frankly, I didn't know that was going to happen. I mean, maybe lots of people do, but maybe I don't watch close enough. But that was, honestly, shocking, if not surprising, maybe is the phrase for it. And so again, thinking about translating that for a classroom, bringing it up, where does it fit? And when I say continuum, it's not only what came before, which is, the fun of history, but I don't know what's going to happen genuinely, right? I don't know what tomorrow or next week or next month is going to bring. And so I think, it's the farther back you go, you can see the continuum in a certain way, but it is really hard when you're in the middle of it.
Yeah. One of our amazing colleagues, Chris Jansen, put it perfectly. He talked about how it's hard to discuss history's first draft. And I'm going to have to look, I know I had tweeted it out before, look at who it's attributed to, but that really struck me. Like, we really are looking at the first draft of what, in 20 years, even next year, how people are going to view this event that happened on the 6th. And it's hard as a classroom teacher, because I mean, even just last year, when we were talking about the impeachment, students want to know things so quickly, but that unfortunately is just not how, we process things. And Kimberly said that she teaches adults and in conferences with her students, many have asked not to talk about it because they want that time to process. And I think that's the thing, is some people want to talk about it right away. Some people want time to process. There's no one solution to this.
Yeah. That's I think the artistry of teaching, right, is those choices. Not only the how, but to back up and say the whether you talk about it is a choice as well. The kinds of words, how you phrase it, when you place it, being sensitive to the students in front of you and their needs, where they're at, is definitely a key part of it. I think Kimberly makes a great point about that, and you did as well. Like, there's teaching about what's going on, but we're also human beings with our own emotions about it. And that doesn't mean, does that mean I have to change it's just that you're going through something as you're experiencing it, right? Presenting something that you are having a feeling about, like a visceral feeling about, is really, really tough. And so I think, I mean, if that's the news of the week, then I think raising those questions is definitely key and definitely important. But I think it's important also to sort of backtrack a little bit, right? That was the first week of January 2021, and the original intent that we had was, what about all of 2020 in hindsight, right? What about coming back from there? So time for the new segment, which is 2020 in hindsight. That's what we were promising to folks out there. And I thought we'd take just a little bit of time to consider that. Like, how do we wrap our heads around that? It's near history as history teachers.
It is, again, being a teacher in that first part of it, and my husband is a teacher too. I don't even know how to start to wrap my head around it, because I mentioned the impeachment. It was like, that just happened last year. It feels like that happened a long time ago, because time was so different, so we went virtual in March, thinking it'd be a week, then it turned into a whole quarter. And then even starting, with BRI, it's all virtual, and it's such a different world. And, I invited myself to write these things down, because I'm like, I'm sure someday my daughter is going to be in high school and be like, hey, Mom, what do you remember about 2020? And I remember I was on my computer all the time. That's because that was the main form of communication. And it's even now, I mean, I know we're in 2021 and we're a couple weeks removed, but even now, the thought of wrapping my head around everything last year is just so crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you absolutely nailed it. Barbara mentioned something similar, and nothing more relevant than being a civics teacher lately, right? I mean, what a job to have. But I think you're right. You said something that I think is really interesting, which is about time. So, something I found interesting teaching students was there's a trust in older history, right? Books have been written, it's been analyzed, you have a lot of people weighing in. Recent history is tough. And if anything else, 2020 just happened. Our students just lived through it. And yet, even just living through it, time feels warped. Like, to say when something happened, I mean, people, make the joke about Blur's Day, but it's true. You can live through something, and the human mind is wild in that the history of that thing still can get warped, even if it just more or less happened in the past year. And I think, I guess my reaction to that is twofold. One is what to do about it, right? It's just the automatic roll up the sleeves. And some of our other webinars and things, we talked about, how important recording it is, how important journaling is, how important, the record of your experiences. How do you know what we were doing February, March a year ago, or even what happened again back to a week ago? And I think that's the second part, is rooting it in some kind of lens. And I think, what we do here is rooting it in big principles, right? Things that are bigger than ourselves. So if we're going to go back to how we started talking about last week, the concept of rule of law, I think, is a big part of the story. That is a way to not only record, but also to understand as it's happening. Because I think if you're understanding it better as things are happening, and I think the way to understand things better, one of the ways to do it, is to root it in something like these bigger concepts. Then it kind of makes more sense for yourself, at least, if not other people.
Yes. The chat's going. So Karen, I totally agree with you. If nothing else, students, and I think just people in general, understand that our freedoms are not unlimited. There are consequences, especially when violence is involved. And, Barbara says Shank, the Brandenburg case, that has really come up a lot lately. And so what I love about history and civics is I feel like always a connection somewhere. And so, Brandenburg case, I believe, was in the 60s. I really hope I'm not wrong, but so 60 years ago, gosh, see, even that, I still think last decade, the 1990s, but whatever. Yeah. But these connections and things are happening, even with the pandemic. I then was like, gosh, I don't really know a whole lot about the influenza, that happened at the beginning of the 1900s. I kind of want to know a little bit more about that, because now I'm wondering about like mask mandates and if they did that, and just there's so much of a connection that can be made with things that happened last year, 2020, still with, like you said, kind of that more established history, if that makes sense.
Sure. No, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. I think, and by more established, I simply mean farther back in time.
Yeah.
Like it's not a,
Yes.
yeah, it's not a feature of what happened. It's just that how long ago it occurred gives more opportunity. But I kind of really like that. There's the being mindful to record. I guess there's 4 things we've now talked about: how we phrase things, how we record it as we live through it, what bigger principles we're rooting them in, and then how do we connect it to other things. I mean, we're moving right along, but it sounds like that's our segue to our next segment of this very short episode. What is that, you may say? Well, I like to call it zoom in. No, zoom. A little play on the technology we're using, but also to kind of do a deep dive. So you, Liz, brought to my attention talking about connecting to things, and you used the phrase more established in the past, and ways of learning things, rooting it in principles that are kind of bigger. You found a really good resource in our Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. Now, again, if you're not familiar, when I say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I mean a massive resource on civics and U.S. history. That is, when I say massive, is just so many different things. We're going to probably talk about it a lot. There's lots of different elements to it. Can you talk a little bit about what this is and where it fits in?
Yes. So first of all, when Life, Liberty, and Pursuit of Happiness came out, I was so bummed I wasn't in the classroom anymore, because it's free, by the way, but it is just a wealth of resources. And the thing that I had pointed out was the election of 1800 and a point counterpoint. It is an interesting thing to, look at the contentious 2020 election and understanding that this is not the first time this has happened. And I love this resource because it asks the question, was the election of 1800 a political revolution? And it gives students 2 sides. So you have 2 amazing scholars that are each writing for it. So Dr. Bailey and Dr. Estes, who I've worked with both of them, and I absolutely, Dr. Estes, if you're watching, hello, and Dr. Bailey, but they give just the information. And so the nice thing about this is students can look at 2 sides and kind of map out the arguments, because I love this, because we're trying to teach students in civic education how to, be argumentative, not fight about things. So, what are the facts? What are some people's perspectives of history? Point counterpoint is all through LLPH. There's a lot of really good questions, but this one in particular was something I had brought up because I felt like if we're looking at the contentious election of 2020, giving kids that little bit of, this is not the first time an election has been contentious. Let's look at a different one, and let's look at that through the view of, again, we say established history, but history that's been looked at in so many different ways. And that's why I just really love this resource.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the setup. What I'm showing here, I hope I'm showing here, is from the resource itself. Just a backtrack of how I got here. I've signed up for OpenStax. It's a platform that has this. We also are hosting it on our site as well. But it's a free resource for all teachers. And you mentioned it's just one of many different elements. When I said lots of resources, every section you can do narratives, you can look at essays, you can primary sources. This one specifically is the point counterpoint. And I love the way that it's sort of set up to zoom in on this, that there's the issue itself, which was posed to these scholars. And independent of each other, they each made a different claim about it. And you use the word arguments, interesting, in not fighting, right? Because I think that word argument literally is a claim that is defensible with evidence and is explained in such a way. And I think having that core question really, really helps on this. And that, I mean, that's a great one because it zeroes in on, you know, there's a big scope you can go into the impacts, but this is a very clear sort of question. Now, of these claims, the way that they explain that, I'm interested what you think. I really like how they laid out for younger people. You know, they were very forward in why they thought the way they did, even though they were not the same perspective. But they laid out sort of the logic, but also a bit of the history you need to know, putting things in context. And I think, you know, you said earlier, I think that's awesome if you are trying to understand what's happening right now. Can we do that? Like, here's a question. I'm just going to throw this at you. We didn't practice this ahead of time, Liz. You ready? How long does it take to get that perspective?
I cannot remember where I read this, but I read somewhere that 20 years
Wow.
is like the key, because enough time has passed for most people, not for everybody. The emotion of it has passed. Even thinking about this, you know, when will we be able to, and I say we kind of as the collective we, when will society be able to look at the events of today with, I mean, I look at the election of 1800 and I've read tons of books, you know, Hamilton, the musical made it super famous. I look at it though in a very non-emotional way because it's 1800, like,
Right.
I can't even name any of my relatives that were alive back then.
Right.
To me, and that might even change though, because of social media and because we have the ability, you know, through like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or even Pinterest, we have the ability to like look back at the pictures that we posted and like look at all this stuff. I think it might be less than 20 years now, but I don't know, maybe a decade.
So the answer is not immediately, is what you're saying.
It's not going to be 2022, I think.
Right. So to reframe how we started all of this, like looking back at 2020, we're not quite there yet.
No.
On how we look at it. But I think there are tools, again, back to that particular resource. They mention, and I took down notes here as I was reading it, I guess it's just really good. You know, how Dr. Bailey talks about how what Thomas Jefferson was saying about it at the time versus how we take a look at it, and how he's posing what it is that's going on. I thought there were really interesting phrases, Dr. Estes as well, about reaching toward being aware that the actions you're doing, and I'm talking about the 1800, but it could be anything. I'm going to try to phrase it because they phrased it better than I did. How in the actions you're doing, you could be aware of how well they're living up to or countering bigger principles. And that's a point that they both kind of make. They both talk about like federalism and republicanism and what Jefferson intended to do. They bring up the Louisiana Purchase, and they're like, he could be aware of these big principles. And really, you know, hey, we're all friends here. Talking about Jefferson having principles versus actions, right, is a topic that comes up in the classroom a lot. That awareness of those principles and how things are living up to it, that's how we're discussing even things happening today and yesterday, right? That you can take a look at actions and say, are they living up to or striving for bigger principles, or are they counter to those things? I don't know what you think of that.
It is super interesting because I know in my education of like people like Thomas Jefferson, you know, it was a very one-dimensional view. And the more I've gotten into history, the more, you know, these are people. Thomas Jefferson is a person. People who are living today were people. And I think that sometimes, especially with the presidency, we demand such perfection from a person, whoever that might be. And I mean, I love the point counterpoints, one, because they're written really well for students, so students can understand them. But on all of the scholars that I've read, it's not a definitive thing. It's just like, if you're asking me to say yes, here is kind of my reasoning in that. And I love looking at how that, goes in a classroom. Because when you ask students questions, like you could ask them, do you think the 2020 election is going to be a political revolution similar to 1800? There's not actually an answer to that. You're just inviting research and you're inviting discussion. And I mean, that's why I love the point counterpoints, but especially when you have something to kind of compare it to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love the phrase and the inviting to discussion, and that there's not one answer to memorize about all of this, and educators are human too, right? That we don't have the answers, but we can guide you to how to make good claims, and we can guide to what our historical thinking and things like that. I think that's really important.
Yeah, the more you know, the more you find out. Like, you might change your mind and be like, actually, now I have this new information and I'm kind of shifting my thoughts, and that's a normal thing. As we learn things, our thoughts shift, and that's, I think, what we need to teach our students too. Like, as you grow and you learn and you have these new experiences, I mean, that's the great thing about history, is it's not just done.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's a cycle. Vince refers to it as a feedback loop. He says that he agrees with the idea that the internet has shortened the feedback loop. He says maybe 5-10 years, maybe closer to 10. I don't know how that's going to change in the future. I don't know if it's hard to imagine it being even shorter than that, but I guess, I mean, look at what we've experienced. Here I am speculating, which leads us to yet another segment. I'm enjoying this kind of moving along thing. We talked about hindsight being 2020. Well, we promised, what about foresight for 2021? What's next? Weird history of the future, as they call it. And it is possible. As historians, I think we get locked into present and past.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to study or to use historical inquiry for what hasn't happened yet? I'm just throwing easy questions at you in our first episode, Liz.
I think yes. I think that one of the things I have noticed that's been kind of a bright spot for 2020 and going into 2021 is educators engaging with each other on different mediums. Teaching can be really lonely because yes, you're with students, but we're not with colleagues, because we're in our classrooms and we're doing all of this stuff, and it shifts the way we learn. So for educators, now it's like, I can reach out on Twitter, I can watch things like this on YouTube and give students examples and have this. And it's an interesting thing to think, when we talk about the 1800s, we know a lot of things because they wrote them down.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like now? Does that look like, people putting things online? Does it look like, what? And I think there is always a way to compare, but knowing what's coming is kind of like, that was my thing for 2020. Every time somebody asked me, I'd be like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Everything changes every day. And it's different, but those skills still matter. Being able to develop argumentative, thesis statements or claims, that kind of stuff still matters. It just matters in a different way. So instead of writing it down, like Thomas Jefferson might have, now we're looking at what people put online, and it's so much faster.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that there is a way to use those skills and to use history to, I don't want to say predict the future because that's wrong, but look at how things will interact. Maybe that's.
Yeah, absolutely. There's trends are never perfect, but understanding them informs you better.
Mm-hmm.
I also think, there's a bit of logic that goes into it. The if this happens, then this is likely to happen. It may not, in which case, if it doesn't, then this other thing. And it's almost like a tree of causation that happens, right? That I think students can wrap their head around that it's what is likely. We mentioned the phrase earlier, shocked but not surprised, right? I mean, there are ways a little bit to kind of predict is a very strong word.
Yeah.
Is to make educated guesses about the future. to have hypotheses, to understand probabilities. You know, and the weird thing is you can make choices that impact that in some way. Now, it's a good question about how much on a societal scale, but you know, your day-to-day life, you know, it is different than what has already happened, because you've got lots and like you said, lots of human beings making choices, and that's what's making the history of the future happen all the time.
Yep. And I think it's worth noting, you know, we've talked about this before, Gary, like you and I are very different people. We've had very different backgrounds, and even the way people are perceiving history is different depending on, you know, what geographical location you're from. There's a ton of factors in it. And you're both right. Like when we were sharing our experiences earlier, I was raised in rural Iowa and Gary's in New York, and both of those experiences are real. They're just very different.
Oh, absolutely. Sure. And again, that not only older history, having moved from New York, grew up on Long Island and then moved out of New York and now in Virginia, even the version of older history is phrased differently. Now, part of that might also be time passing, which so I don't want to say it's just geographic, right? There's the way I learned it in high school was a very different time than now. More books have come out, you know, new information has emerged, new perspectives. You know, go ahead.
I said the internet. There
The
was
internet.
no internet when I was in high school, and that dates me, but I just do not.
No, I remember having to. Forgive us, everybody watching, but I mean, I remember that too. I remember having to purchase credits to like have internet time, you know, and things like that. Like that's like, oh, you have 5 more minutes of internet time because it's a limited resource, I guess. I mean, you're right. So like the chronological time difference and experiences is really pretty amazing. So did we answer the question about foresight? I think the answer is we can make somewhat educated guesses, but it is the skill of how we're understanding the future and recognizing our place in history, I think is an important one. I mean, that's a grand sum up, but I don't think we got there. But I mean, Barbara agrees, at least technology alone has made a huge impact. So thank you, Barbara. I think she supports our thesis. Speaking of Barbara, I want to pivot to actually our last segment, one that we're always going to have. We want to invite all of you who are here today and people in the future. Whether or not you're here live, we want to welcome some questions that you have. We want to welcome thoughts, questions, anything that occur. So between now and our next episode, which will be on the 26th, whether or not you can make the 26th, we hope you do. There are ways to reach out to us. And as I said, your questions might form parts of future episodes or even just be brought up. And you might see your question or your comments arise even if you're not here live. But what do you say, Liz? We pivot to that last section, which is our mailbag. Digital mail, of course. You know, for the most part, I think responding to us through Twitter is a good way to do it. That's hashtag BRI Teacher Time at BR Institute, BRI Institute on our Twitter. We'll put that up at the end there, but we had some great comments here. I think we hopefully addressed them. If some come up, that's pretty well. I want to read one from Aaron, who wrote one earlier and sent us to us. Again, we post the questions up this year. This episode's question is, how are we planning on teaching and living in 2021? Next question is actually going to be about materials. Let me save that for the end here. Here's the question that we had. You ready, Liz? It's not a small question.
Okay.
This is in response to how are we planning on teaching and living in 2021. And the question Aaron had was, how do we develop empathy or emotional intelligence in ourselves? And why are these skills important or central to history and civics?
Oof. So
that's, we can break it down.
I think that when I hear that question, when I did my undergrad, like that, we didn't get taught that. We got taught a lot of content, and I love my undergrad. I love my college. the development of that, I think, really just comes from practicing and being with like-minded people. So if you're trying to practice empathy or even like argumentation, like I I feel, Gary, you and I have a good relationship. And so if there was something we disagreed on, it's the art of practice, and it's the art of understanding that you're the expert in your classroom. You don't have to know everything, but you know your students and you know your content and you know how to deliver it. So those teachers that are like, because some people are really empathetic people. And so being able to discuss things really quickly is hard for them because they have to kind of figure it out. I think empathy is really important in just society as a whole. When we look at things like civil discourse, I mean, for me, it was practicing, it was having those conversations. And when I made a mistake, even in the classroom, saying, like, I made that mistake, I'm really sorry, and learning from it. And that's such a hard thing to do, especially in a world where if you do something wrong on social media, it's this different culture. And that is, as teachers, I think also just being honest with your kids. When you're talking to them, if when I would talk about the Chicago race riots, like, I'm a white female, I have no idea what this is like. So this is the perspective I'm speaking from. Or, I'm from Arizona, so I don't know what it's like to live on the East Coast right now and worry about the Capitol stuff because I'm all the way out west. But understanding that people aren't perfect, and although I'll never know what it's like to be profiled for my race, I'll never know what it's like to have some of these experiences. I can still empathize, and I can say that out loud. And I think that's really important too.
Oh, I definitely think that's important. Recognizing that one needs to, I think is definitely recognizing in oneself the work that needs to be done. I completely agree with. And you started off by saying about like your experience. To me, it's heartening over the years since I've been in teacher school, how much work is being done on that.
Mhm.
And some of it, is inherent, but a lot of it can be, and learned is a funny word. You use the word practice. I think that's a really good one, right? It is work to be done. It is something to try to understand. The word empathy is an interesting one, right? Because it's not just like intellectual. It's trying to truly understand something that, you're right, there are things, one's ethnicity, one's race, one's life experience, all of that kind of stuff. You can't truly, you can do more work if you can't fully. It's worth doing, I guess. I don't know if I'm putting that well. I'm certain our teachers can can phrase these things really well, but we're also not going to conquer all that in one conversation, right? We're not. I mean, this is a huge thing that I think hopefully becomes a through line in conversations. And I want to invite teachers to keep it going. This is not a one-time deal. If we can't get into it in the limited time we have in these conversations here, keep talking to us. Put it on our conversational agenda. I think that'd be pretty amazing. So I hate to say it, but we're sort of running out of time, and I really want to keep talking about it. But I think that's a good feeling, right? That's like, oh my God, we didn't even get to so many things. We'll come back. We'll keep having these conversations, and though that might take time, I really hope that people continue to do so. Just to like how I mentioned Twitter. That's one probably good starting point. There are ways to contact us in lots of different ways. I think a lot of our links are below. If you've subscribed here, you'll get information in the description for here. That's great. But if you do follow us at BRI Institute, we'll be monitoring the hashtag BRI Teacher Time hashtag. It's a way to kind of zero in on these conversations. But reach out to us. I feel sort of terrible that we're running out of time, but it's the bell's going to ring. Quite frankly, that's sort of how it works a little bit. And so, were you going to say something, Liz?
I do want to say Michelle brought up to recognizing and confronting inequity and white supremacy in different forms of institution and policies. You're right, Michelle, we haven't addressed it because I don't feel like that's something we can just address quick and then be done with. And like, to me, that's a whole show because
Absolutely.
it is definitely not something I just want to touch on and then move past. But thank you, Michelle, for bringing that kind of to light, because that would be, I think it would be really great to have a scholar on to talk about things like that. Because if I'm being honest, it's something I'm still learning about. And I don't know that I necessarily feel comfortable talking about it because I still have a lot to learn as an educator on topics like that.
Oh, I think you're exactly right. There are things that can be honored more by the time and not just sort of brought up and then dropped, because I think we wouldn't do justice in a quick kind of convo. But that's like sort of exactly what we're hoping for this show, is that you bring up things that are bigger conversations that we can get into, that we can have in future episodes. I mean, or even if there's a chance in within an episode, but definitely we want that back and forth, because we can have more conversation, and I think that's about.
And I have an inside track that maybe a summer institute that we're doing might be looking at something like that. So
Summer Institute, when you say that, do you mean the multi-day long program that we put on every summer? It used to be called Founders Fellowship. Now it's called Summer Institute. Yeah, I think ideas of justice and whatnot might come in there. I know, no spoilers here. Students also are going to have an opportunity with our Constitutional Academy to get into topics of equality and justice. In fact, right now, there is an essay out there that students are invited to check out called the We the Students contest. Anyway, yes. Lots of stuff, so much stuff. We'll keep talking about it more. But I did want to say to everyone who's there, everyone who contributed to chatting or watching or just part of this conversation, I just want to say thank you for tuning in. If you did like the video, and if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, it's a good way to kind of keep these going. We'll be back again on January 26th for another Teacher Time. We're going to take a look in that episode on the intricacies of like what teaching what is and is not in the textbook, which I think is a really interesting topic, right? So there's like how to teach what is there and to acknowledge what isn't there, and what we do about all that. And so if you have thoughts or questions about teaching what is and is not in the curriculum, shoot it to us in the ways that we mentioned in the areas below. We'll be putting out new episodes for this series every other Tuesday. The YouTube channel in general, if you're not familiar with it, puts out new videos twice a week on things in U.S. history. There's close reads of primary sources. There are scholar talks with distinguished scholars around the country. There's homework help videos designed for students to kind of get caught up in learning more, learning further, sort of the pieces, the elements of the things we're talking about. And you can always join us in conversation on Facebook and Twitter or Instagram for updates on the programs that we have, the events that we have, lots of different ways to get involved. But ultimately, we just want to hear from you. So if you can comment your thoughts on the video or get in touch with us any of the ways that we know how. Thanks, Liz, for spending some time with me during tea time.
Thank you. This was fun. Cheers.
That's good times. That's good. Yeah, and we hope to talk to everybody soon, and otherwise we'll see everybody in about 2 weeks.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks for coming.